Welcome, friend, to this peaceful hour, where the noise of the world quiets just enough for history to whisper back. Dim the lights, lower your screen brightness, let your shoulders fall from your ears, and your breath remember the shape of stillness. 'Cause tonight, we're not just remembering what happened, we're remembering what was endured, what was buried, what was never written down, but echoes in the bones, in the blood, in the unspoken inheritances of our time-worn DNA. This is Sleepless Homo, a quiet corner of the internet, where bedtime means returning to the beginning, to the myths we lived, to the truths we survived, and to the terrifyingly ordinary things that once passed for normal. I'd love to know where you're listening from, what city or country, what strange hour your soul pressed play. It still amazes me how history can bring strangers together across continents, time zones, and insomnia. And if this kind of calm, poetic storytelling helps you wind down, consider subscribing. We have many more ancestral echoes to untangle. It is one of the strangest discoveries in human history, one that no one saw coming, one that, until very recently, no one even knew had happened. Around the 4th millennium before the Common Era, something invisible swept across the earth. Not a plague, not a famine, but a vanishing of men. A genetic collapse so sudden and so total that up to 90% of male lineages were wiped from the human family tree, almost overnight. We only found out about it thousands of years later by accident. Not through ruins, not through scrolls or carvings, not even through the bones, but through the genes, or more precisely, through what was missing from them. It started with a strange pattern. Geneticists studying the Y chromosome. The strand of DNA passed from father to son began to notice something odd. While mitochondrial DNA inherited from mothers remained relatively stable across regions and eras, the diversity in Y chromosomes had plummeted. Sometime between the 5th and 3rd millennia before the Common Era, something had happened to the men. Their genetic branches, once varied and vast, snapped off, collapsed, erased. To put it more plainly, almost every man alive today is descended from a startlingly small number of male ancestors from that period. While women kept passing on their genes through various lineages, the male side of the tree thinned, and then thinned again, until only a handful of branches remained. Imagine a great oak struck by lightning, its limbs sheared down to just a few stubborn trunks. That is the human Y chromosome. That is your father's 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 ghost. This phenomenon is now known as the neolithic Y chromosome bottleneck, and its discovery has been described as one of the most haunting revelations in the field of genetics. The term bottleneck refers to any event in evolutionary history where genetic diversity shrinks dramatically, typically due to natural disaster, disease, or environmental collapse. But this one was different. This one, it seemed, was targeted, gendered, selective. Because while the Y chromosome crumbled, the mitochondrial DNA held steady. In other words, women were not vanishing, only men, and not even all men, just most. A few, it seems, were multiplying profoundly. Ancient DNA analysis has come a long way in the last 2 decades. Thanks to advances in high-resolution genome sequencing and statistical modelling, scientists can now reconstruct not just population movements, but population disappearances. What emerged from these studies was clear. Sometime between 5,000 and 3,000 years before the Common Era, the male side of humanity underwent a genetic collapse. And it was not a local event, it was global, affecting regions as far apart as Europe, the Near East, Central Asia, and parts of Africa. The question was no longer if this had happened, the question was why. Was it disease? Some thought so. But most plagues do not discriminate by sex, especially not on this scale. Was it famine? Again, unlikely. Starvation reduces population, but it doesn't selectively erase lineages, and certainly not globally and not consistently across different climates. Could it be coincidence? Statistical fluke? The math said otherwise. The pattern was too precise, too clean. Eventually, a chilling theory emerged. What if this was not biology? What if this was society? What if thousands of years ago, a new kind of war had begun, not one of survival, but of legacy? A war not just over land, but over reproduction itself. You see, around this time something else was happening. Agriculture had spread. Villages were becoming towns, social hierarchies were hardening. For the first time, human beings were organising themselves into clans, and in many places, These clans were patrilineal, that is, land under power and names passed from father to son. In a world like that, war changes. It becomes personal, strategic, total. You no longer fight simply to win a dispute. You fight to eliminate a bloodline, to wipe a rival clan off the map, and in doing so you do not need to kill everyone, just the men, the ones who would pass on the name, the power, the line. The women you absorb, marry, take, or worse. This, geneticists now believe, is what happened. Over the course of several centuries, male-on-male violence among patrilineal clans escalated into a slow-motion purge. Entire lineages were exterminated, not through plague but through conquest. And the victors, they didn't just win territory, they fathered the next generation, and the next, and the next. One recent study, led by Tianchen Zheng and colleagues at Stanford University and published in Nature Communications, used mathematical modelling to show how such social structures could lead to the very bottleneck we now observe. Their simulations suggested that if a few dominant males had exclusive reproductive rights within their clans, and if entire rival clans were regularly wiped out, the result would be exactly what we see: a steep selective collapse in Y-chromosome diversity over time. In other words, this was not random, this was structured, this was social. But not the kind of war we imagine, not the cinematic kind with trumpets and battlefields and heroes. This was quieter, more insidious. It was the war of the bloodline, the war of who gets to be remembered, of who gets to exist. And it worked. Today, in many parts of the world, a majority of men share Y-chromosome ancestry with a shockingly small group of Bronze Age patriarchs. In Western Europe, for example, the R1b haplogroup, a single genetic lineage, accounts for the vast majority of male ancestry. In South and Central Asia, the story is similar with haplogroup R1a. These were the survivors, or more accurately, the winners. The rest? The men whose branches once sprawled across the world, whose names are gone, whose stories were never told. They are ghosts now, not even myths, just silence. And this is where our story truly begins. Not in a ruin, not in a temple, but in the absence of fathers, in the echo of something erased, a family tree with snapped limbs, 1,000 histories that will never be written. Because what happened during the Y-chromosome bottleneck was not just a shift in genetics, it was a shift in civilization, a quiet genocide that left no witnesses, a turning point that still shapes the structure of power, memory, and masculinity today. And the scariest part? We didn't even know it happened, until our own blood told the tale. Tonight we follow that tale back, into the fields, into the tombs, into the shattered villages of a world torn between memory and myth. This is not just the story of how men disappeared. This is the story of how history was rewritten, not with ink, but with sperm, not with words, but with wounds. Let us go back, then, to the last time the family tree was whole. 7,000 years ago the world was quieter. Not in the sense of silence, no, the forest chattered with birds and the rivers argued with their stones, but quiet in its rhythm. The earth had warmed after the last great ice age, and humans, still shaped by tens of thousands of years of migration and foraging, were just beginning to settle in place. It was the early Neolithic, a time when the pace of change was glacial, and most of the planet remained wild. Civilization had not yet become a habit. It was a long moment of learning how to stay put. Across what we now call Europe, Asia, and parts of the Near East, scattered communities began to tether themselves to soil. The domestication of wheat and barley, einkorn and emmer, lentils and goats, meant that for the first time in our species' long and restless journey, people could raise food where they lived rather than follow it. Villages sprouted slowly, wooden huts with woven walls, hearths in the centre, sleeping mats at the edges. There was no royalty yet, no monuments, just kin groups and clans, huddled close. In these early agrarian societies, life moved seasonally, cyclically. The moon was still a calendar, not a metaphor, and the sky told time better than any sundial ever would. Children grew up beside their grandparents, and each field bore the memory of the ones who dug it first. There was no standing army, no temple priests or palace scribes. If war existed, it was rare and intimate, quarrel between cousins, not a campaign. Archaeological remains from places like Çatalhöyük in Anatolia or Skara Brae off the coast of Scotland show no fortifications, no weapons caches, no mass graves from this era. The homes were often built wall to wall, their roofs used as walkways, and the people buried their dead under the floors of their homes, as if to stay connected. Egalitarianism wasn't an ideal. It was simply what made sense when survival required cooperation, when no surplus was large enough to hoard. The most valuable thing was memory. Memory of which seeds thrived where, of how to carve stone tools, of when to move the herds and where the spring water ran deepest. This was a knowledge economy, but it ran on intimacy, not hierarchy. The elders were not kings, they were libraries, and the wealthiest among them might have owned 2 goats instead of 1. Kinship was the organising principle. Not the nuclear family, not the individual, but the clan. A group that shared ancestry, tools, myths and fields. Inheritance passed through shared labour, not rigid patriarchy. There is evidence in some Neolithic sites of matrilineal lines, or at least matrilocal customs suggesting a time before male dominance became default. Gender roles existed, yes, but they were likely fluid, often pragmatic. The one who could spin flax or dig a trench or soothe a child did so, regardless of anatomy. And then slowly something changed. The crops got better. The herds got larger. A few groups figured out irrigation. Others stumbled onto metallurgy copper, soft and glinting, the first flirtation with tools that could cut more than just wood. For the first time there was something extra, surplus. And with surplus came storage. With storage came someone to guard it. With guarding came power. And with power came inequality, creeping in like mould in a granary. It didn't happen everywhere at once. In fact, the timing varies wildly depending on region. In parts of the Levant, the process began earlier, around 8,000 years ago. In Europe, it took root more firmly by the 6th millennium before the Common Era. In each place, however, the pattern rhymed. Surplus allowed choice, choice allowed ownership, ownership invited hierarchy. Now, the fields no longer belong to everyone. Now the tools might be locked away. Now the house with the deepest storeroom grew higher walls, and the elders became gatekeepers instead of guides. The clan began to stratify. Those with more cattle married into those with more grain. A prestige economy flickered into being not with coins or palaces, but with access. Access to resources, mates, and memory itself. Inheritance shifted too. Rather than shared, it became secured. Kinship narrowed. Where once the group raised the child, now the line of descent became a tool of possession. Whose child, whose land, whose right to lead? These were questions that bred tension, especially as more and more land became claimed. Patrilineal descent began to dominate, not because it was inevitable, but because it served a new logic: control. To maintain this new order, stories changed. Myths evolved. The oldest tales of spirits in rivers and animals as kin began to make room for ancestral founders, for divine patriarchs, for heroes who claimed land and passed it to sons. Rituals once centered on seasons now included sacrifices, and the bodies buried beneath the homes began to include grave goods, beads, blades, sometimes animals, symbolic tokens of status. Still, the change was slow. For centuries, even millennia, the old and new ways coexisted. There were villages where surplus still meant sharing. There were valleys where kinship remained wide and fluid. But the logic of hierarchy, once introduced, was hard to unlearn. It fed itself. Surplus allowed dominance, and dominance secured more surplus. The gap widened, and with it came a new possibility, a dark one. What if you didn't just want your lineage to inherit your wealth, but to inherit everything? What if another group's existence wasn't just competition, but threat? That question had never truly existed before. It required a mindset born of stability. When people are always moving, always adjusting to the land, other clans are neighbours. But when land is fixed and ownership enshrined, other clans are obstacles. And in a world where wealth is stored, passed down and guarded, the surest way to protect your future might be to erase someone else's. This is the hinge, the moment before the snap. A world where hierarchy is young, memory is still communal, and war has not yet scaled. But the ingredients are gathering. The walls are rising. The surplus is stockpiled. And somewhere in a quiet village by a winding stream, a father tells his son not just how to plant barley, but how to defend it. Soon the bloodlines will narrow, the battles will begin, and the silence in our chromosomes will write the first chapter of the world we still live in today. But for now, let the quiet hold. Remember that it was not always this way. The rupture has not yet come, but it is near, and when it arrives, it will leave more than bones. It will leave a silence deep enough to echo down 7,000 years of silence in the blood. It began slowly, as most tragedies do, not with fire or blood, but with seeds, with little bundles of grain pressed into the earth by calloused hands. Somewhere between 8,000 and 7,000 years ago, the human world began to harden into something new. In scattered corners of Europe and the Near East, across river valleys and wooded plains, people who once wandered with the seasons began to settle, to dig, to plant. It did not feel like war, it felt like stability, but under every harvest basket, a different kind of weapon was quietly growing. Before agriculture, there was motion. Communities of foragers moved like breath across the land, gathering what the forest offered, hunting in short bursts, dancing with the cycles of game and fruit and weather. Disputes existed, of course, but they were brief territorial squabbles, moments of stress. Without permanent property, there was little to hoard. With little to hoard, there was little to fight over for long. And so for tens of thousands of years, violence remained personal, intimate, local. But around 6,000 years before the present, a quiet revolution changed everything. Farming brought with it the notion of surplus, a full granary, a dependable herd. Stored calories meant stored power, and stored power became something worth guarding. For the first time, people began to think long-term, to plan not just for this winter, but for 10 winters from now. Grain became security, goats became currency, and land, the one thing you could not move or multiply, became sacred. With this shift came the beginning of inequality. In small Neolithic villages from Anatolia to the Danube, households that had more could offer more, feasts, favours, protection. And soon they asked for something in return. The seeds of hierarchy were buried beside the barley. Certain families grew larger, not just in size but in influence. Children born into these homes learned early that food meant leverage, and leverage meant authority. As excavations from early settlements like Çatalhöyük or Vinça suggest, some houses began to store not just food but tools, ornaments, tokens of ritual. Status was becoming a physical object. It wasn't just land that could be passed down. Daughters too became part of the economy. As social bonds hardened into clans and kinship networks, marriage was no longer merely about union, it became transaction. Daughters were given as tokens of peace, tools of diplomacy, or proof of loyalty. These exchanges were rarely romantic, they were strategic. And as families began to calculate their legacy, something strange happened to the way humans thought about blood. Patrilineality. The idea that descent, identity, and inheritance passed through the male line emerged as a dominant structure. It wasn't inevitable. Many earlier societies traced descent through the mother or used flexible clan affiliations, but in a world where land meant power and power meant defence, men became the axis around which the machinery of legacy turned. Sons were not just children, they were carriers of the name, holders of the plot, the next in line. This shift reshaped everything. In a patrilineal world, you do not just protect your home, you defend your lineage. The stakes were no longer personal, they were generational. To lose a fight was not just to die, it was to see your name erased from the world. And so communities began to build not just fences, but fortresses. Early settlements show signs of enclosure ditches, palisades, watch posts. The Neolithic had become nervous. Archaeological layers across Europe tell the story in clay and bone. Around 5,000 years ago, sites like Talheim in Germany and Schletz-Aspern in Austria show mass graves, dozens of bodies, many with crushed skulls, broken limbs, or evidence of restraint. These were not the casualties of a sudden brawl. They were the aftermath of extermination. Whole communities snuffed out, and if one looks closer, a pattern emerges. More men than women, more adults than children. Perhaps the women were taken, perhaps the children absorbed, but the men especially were destroyed. Why? Because in a patrilineal structure, the rival male is not just an enemy, he is a legacy, a bloodline, a future threat. Kill him, and you do not just win the battle, you remove the possibility of revenge. This is how clan-based warfare began to escalate into something far more lethal. Not just raids, not even massacres, but erasures. The deliberate unmaking of bloodlines. Intergroup rivalry hardened. As the centuries rolled forward, the genetic record began to reflect the consequences. Studies from recent decades, especially those published between 2015 and 2020, show a sharp collapse in Y-chromosome diversity around this time. While mitochondrial DNA, the line passed down through mothers, remained relatively stable, the paternal lineage fragmented, vanished. It was not famine, it was not plague, it was selection, the selection of power by blade and fire. This was the crucible in which early patriarchal systems were forged. Those clans that survived those whose sons continued became dominant. They controlled not just fields, but stories, rituals, access. A new social logic emerged. Defend your land, marry your daughters strategically, raise your sons to fight. The warrior elite was forming even before swords existed. Even now one can walk the outlines of ancient villages in the archaeological record and feel the ghost of this change. At first they are simple, circular huts, communal courtyards, shared ovens, but later the houses grow asymmetrical, some bigger, some fortified. The placement of graves changes too, some men buried with axes, ornaments, signs of ritual importance, others with nothing at all. The social fabric was no longer even, it had been sliced. And it was not just territory that fueled these early rivalries, it was legacy. Control over daughters meant control over alliance, control over sons meant control over reproduction. Defeated clan could not simply be left alone, its males had to be removed, its daughters folded into the victor's kin. This was how the Y-chromosome bottleneck emerged, not through a single genocide, but through countless small-scale eliminations, each one resetting the family tree. Patrilineality turned power into biology, and from there, biology became politics. Bloodlines, once fluid and diverse, narrowed into a few surviving streams. Today, in much of Europe and Asia, most men descend from just a handful of Y-chromosomal ancestors who lived in this era. Their rivals, their cousins, their stories, gone. Gone, not because of accident or illness, but because land became power. And once power had a shape, a tool, a rule, it needed a plan, and that plan over thousands of years slowly became law. The law of inheritance, the law of the eldest son, the law of the sword. There was no vote, no declaration, no dawn where people woke and said, "Today we will create patriarchy." It happened in the silos, in the feasts, in the whispered calculations of men deciding which sons to favour, which daughters to trade, which brothers to trust. And each generation the rules became firmer, the walls taller, the graves deeper. By the time metallurgy arrived, when copper and then bronze entered the human toolkit, the systems were already in place. The weapon only made it more efficient, but the war, in truth, had begun with the plough, with the harvest, with the birth of a future that could be hoarded, and so the next part of the story unfolds not in shadows, but in fire. Because once land had become power, power needed teeth, and the world was about to learn what it meant to be ruled not by the many, but by the few, not by the tribe, but by the bloodline. A new chapter was beginning, and it would be written in ash. Beneath a quiet German field, the bones told a story no one remembered. They were not arranged peacefully. They did not lie in order, nor with reverence. They were tangled, crushed, disarticulated. Some skulls bore the unmistakable marks of blunt trauma, the sharp cracks of a club or axe swung with purpose. Others had clean slices carved into the bone, precision wounds that hinted not at a struggle, but at an execution. This was not a battlefield. This was a grave. And this was not a burial. It was a disposal. Today we call it the Talheim Death Pit. 7,000 years ago, it was simply the end of the world for a small Neolithic community. When archaeologists uncovered Talheim in the 1980s, they had not been looking for a genocide. The pit contained 34 individuals, men, women, children, all dead, all interred hastily, almost as if their killers had wanted to forget them. But there were patterns. Most of the adult males had suffered lethal head trauma. Some children and women had too, but curiously, several of the women and children seemed to have been spared altogether. No valuables were found. No weapons, no markers, no signs of a struggle. It was not war in the heroic sense. It was something colder, more intimate. The entire group had likely been executed by neighbours, possibly kin. The cause? Territory, kinship rivalry, an unresolved insult. Or perhaps something older and harder to name. The Thalheim massacre was not an isolated anomaly. Less than 200 kilometres away, near Schletz-Aspern in Austria, another mass grave told a nearly identical story. Discovered in the 1980s and studied extensively over the next decades, the site revealed the remains of at least 200 individuals. They too had met violent ends. Blunt force trauma dominated the forensic evidence. But what shocked researchers was the positioning of the bodies. Many were flung into the ditch with limbs twisted and necks broken. Others showed signs of mutilation. Some may have died bound. And once again, the ratio of men to women and children was skewed. The men were dead, but the women and children had vanished. These were not pitched battles between rival armies. They were not the chaotic bloodlettings of tribal skirmishes. They were systematic acts of annihilation. And as the graves accumulated across Neolithic Europe, a pattern emerged. In Herxheim, Germany, an even more chilling scene played out. Here, bones of over 500 people had been dismembered and scattered across a ritual enclosure. Many showed signs of defleshing. Skulls had been broken to remove the brain, and long bones were cracked for marrow. Some archaeologists suggested cannibalism. Others saw symbolic violence, but one thing was clear. This was not how a people buried their own. This was how enemies were erased. What united these sites was not geography, but intention. Each spoke of targeted violence. Of a worldview in which the erasure of an entire kin group was not only possible, but permissible. And when researchers began comparing trauma patterns across dozens of sites from France to the Balkans, they saw the same script repeating. Adult males targeted first, skull trauma predominates, execution-style wounds, and a conspicuous absence of young females and children. The suggestion: these survivors were taken, not spared, incorporated, not saved. What kind of world makes policy out of annihilation? To answer that, we have to think not just about violence, but about the structures that make violence durable. By the 5th millennium before the Common Era, Neolithic Europe had settled into a rhythm of village life. But this was no utopia. With agriculture came land ownership. With land came inheritance. With inheritance came hierarchy. And with hierarchy came exclusion. Resources were no longer shared. Surpluses were stockpiled. Wealth could now be hoarded, defended, passed down. Suddenly violence was not a matter of passion, but of strategy. These massacres were not acts of random savagery. They were attempts to rewrite the demographic future. By removing rival males, a victorious clan could absorb the remaining population, take their land, their women, their children, and most importantly, their legacy. The victims would leave no descendants. The victors would multiply. This, it turns out, is how the genome remembers what archaeology does not. Because while stones can be broken and names forgotten, DNA does not lie. The Y-chromosome bottleneck we see between 5,000 and 3,000 years before the Common Era matches these patterns with eerie precision. Across Eurasia, the male genetic landscape narrowed. Some lineages vanished entirely, others exploded in frequency. The graves show the bodies. The genes show the consequences. So were these killings coordinated campaigns? Did early chiefs order the slaughter of entire clans to ensure their own bloodline survived? Perhaps not in the bureaucratic sense we associate with modern war, but they were systematic in a different way. They followed a logic of power, a logic born of scarcity, hierarchy and control, and once that logic emerged, it did not go away. As settlement density increased, so too did the stakes. Boundaries hardened, fortifications appeared, defensive ditches and palisades surrounded villages. A world of flow and movement became a world of borders and siege. Cultural anthropologists like Christian Christiansen and Alistair Whittle have noted that this period marks the beginning of intergroup competition on a scale never before seen, and with competition comes elimination. Even the tools of the killings tell a story. Most victims were killed not with projectiles but with handheld tools, axes, clubs, stone blades. These were not impersonal deaths. They required proximity, intent, repetition. They suggest a kind of violence that was personal, even as it served a collective strategy. There were no bystanders. only participants. Some scholars have proposed that these massacres were more than strategic, that they were also symbolic, a way of severing lineage and memory. In societies where identity was embedded in ancestry, to kill a father was to erase a name. To scatter a clan's bones was to unmake their future. Seen in this light, the slaughter pits of Talheim and Herxheim were not just scenes of death, they were instruments of forgetting. But forgetting, it turns out, is not forever. Today we read these bones like books. Each fracture is a sentence, each pit a paragraph in a history no one intended to write. Through isotope analysis, we know some victims were local, others were not. Some had travelled hundreds of kilometres, some showed signs of healed injuries from previous conflicts. These were not isolated incidents. They were chapters in a continental pattern of escalation. The question is no longer whether these events were massacres. They were. The question is what they tell us about the birth of the organised violence, about the transition from revenge to policy, from feud to extinction, from tribal grievance to demographic engineering. This was the true beginning of total war, not in the scale of the armies, but in the scope of the aim. Eradicate the other, multiply the self, control land, people, legacy. And for those who succeeded, history remembers nothing of the means, only the silence of their rivals, the silence still etched in the soil, and still present hauntingly in our blood. Because while those men died 7,000 years ago, their absence remains. A gap in the Y chromosome, a missing branch on the tree, a massacre that became a memory without words, a policy that became nature, and a warning that beneath civilization, the old logic still sleeps, quiet, patient, waiting. We have inherited the world those killings created. We walk on ground soaked in unsaid history. We speak languages shaped by the survivors. We are the children of the winners, but the bones remind us, the winners were not always the wisest, only the ones who struck first and hardest, and the pit is still open. It begins not with a bone, nor a burial mound, nor a scarred axe abandoned in the soil. It begins in the blood, or more precisely, in the silent absence of it. In the 21st century, armed with algorithms and bone dust, geneticists began noticing something that archaeologists had missed entirely. Peculiar silence, not in stories or scripts, but in lineages, a genomic hush that whispered of something deeply unnatural. Somewhere between 5,000 and 3,000 years before the present, something happened to the men, not the species, not the women, just the men, specifically their Y chromosomes. That strange little sliver of DNA passed only from father to son, generation to generation, like a baton in the great relay of ancestry. And during those ancient centuries, the baton was dropped. Imagine a family tree, not a modern one, tidy with names and dates, but a vast ancient one stretching back through millennia, where every branch is a male bloodline. Now picture that tree suddenly hacked and thinned almost overnight. 90% of its branches vanish, entire limbs lopped off, erased from the genomic record as though they never existed. That is not a metaphor. That's what the Y chromosome tells us. Genetic studies from institutions across the globe, published in journals like Nature Communications and Genome Research, confirmed the same chilling trend. A severe, sudden collapse in male line genetic diversity. The mitochondrial DNA passed through mothers remained relatively stable, preserving the echoes of continuity, but the Y chromosome shrieked with absence. This was no random drift, no gentle bottleneck from a famine or climate shift, because those by nature kill indiscriminately. But here, the loss was surgical, male-specific, a scalpel rather than a storm. It is one of the most pronounced sex-biased bottlenecks ever recorded in the human genome, and it did not happen just once, nor in just one place. Across Eurasia, from the steppes of Central Asia to the river valleys of Western Europe, Y chromosome diversity dropped like a stone. In some regions, up to 90% of male lines were erased within just a few centuries. From many to a few, from countless clans to just a handful of surviving patriarchal trees. To visualize it, imagine a funnel. Wide at the top representing the vast male diversity before the bottleneck, then narrowing sharply the funnel's throat where most lines vanish. Then at the bottom, a tiny stream of male lineages that went on to father the world. This wasn't drift, it was an evolutionary crime scene, and the motive, as always, was power. The story begins to cohere when we compare mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line which remained rich and diverse. This alone rules out plague or famine as the main culprit. Because women lived, women reproduced, their genes continued. If an epidemic had swept through, it would have left scars in both sexes. If it was starvation, the losses would not have been so selectively male. Instead, what we see is an extinction event for men's names, men's bloodlines, the biological records of thousands of clans, gone. What could have done this? One explanation, first proposed by researchers like Tianchen Zheng and furthered by computational modelling teams at Stanford, is both simple and horrifying: warfare. But not just any warfare, not the chaotic kind, not the kill what you must to survive kind. What we're talking about is targeted, deliberate, strategic extermination. A kind of interclan rivalry sharpened to an evolutionary razor, and crucially embedded in patriarchal, patrilineal social structures. In these systems, lineage flows through the father. Clan identity is passed through men. Land is owned, defended, and inherited through male lines. When one clan conquers another, they do not merely displace them. They absorb their women and children and kill the men. All the men. Because to let a rival male live is to let his bloodline continue. And if power is patrilineal, then conquest must be too. The result is what we see in the genome, a blood-soaked pruning of humanity's paternal tree. There is a genetic shadow that trails through these regions. Haplogroups, the broad branches of the Y-chromosome tree, shift suddenly during this period. For example, haplogroup R1b, now dominant across Western Europe, rises dramatically during and after the bottleneck. Before that, it was rare. Likewise, R1a explodes across parts of Eastern Europe and South Asia. These aren't subtle migrations, they're demographic replacements. The fingerprints of population-level takeovers encoded in the double helix. It is tempting to imagine a war, a single apocalyptic event, but that's not quite what the genome shows. What we see is something longer, slower, more systemic. A creeping genocide of ancestry carried out not in a year or even a generation, but over perhaps 20 to 40 generations. The effects would have been invisible to those living through it, like erosion or tide, until one day nothing remained but the bloodlines of the victors. The genomic record suggests that these bottlenecks coincided with the rise of stratified, militarized, and patrilineal societies, which means it wasn't just swords that killed, it was systems. Anthropologists and geneticists alike warn us to be cautious. Genes cannot tell us why, only what, but when the pattern is this stark, and when it aligns so clearly with what we know from archaeological massacre sites, from changes in burial rituals, and from the rise of prestige warrior elites, the picture becomes hard to ignore. The men died, the women lived, and a few lucky fathers rewrote the future. Their sons would go on to inherit the earth. In forensic terms, this is a cold case with thousands of missing persons, and no bones to bury, because this wasn't just a genocide of bodies, it was a genocide of ancestry, a biological silencing of entire identities, a purge written not in blood, but in its absence. To this day, most of the world's male population descends from a shockingly small number of lineages that survived this culling. The others? They are ghosts, not remembered in song or stone, only in the negative space between chromosomes. It is easy to miss how strange that is. We are used to war stories leaving behind monuments, mass graves, weapons, but this one left nothing. No Iliad, no funeral stele, just a wound in the code, a gap in the inheritance. And if not for the slow, methodical work of ancient DNA sequencing, exhuming powder from teeth, analysing markers from degraded bone, we would never have known this happened at all. There is something unnerving about that the single most sweeping culling of male lineages in prehistory, perhaps in all of human history, left not a trace in myth or memory. Only in molecule. It suggests that power, once consolidated, has no incentive to remember what it destroyed, and that history, even our deepest history, is told by survivors, in this case by the few fathers who lived and the many who didn't. So the next time you look at a map of migration, or a chart of haplogroups, or a simple DNA ancestry test, Remember that you are staring not just at the routes taken by your ancestors, but the absences of the ones who never made it. The men who fell not in glory but in swordance, the missing names, the broken tree. History didn't forget them, it never knew them to begin with. It begins with 3 letters, R, J, and a number. It sounds like a catalogue entry or a serial code, something from a warehouse or a library, but it is not. These are the names of the men who survived, or more precisely the names of their lineages, their invisible fingerprints left not on walls or parchment, but on the genetic scaffolding of modern humanity. R1b, R1a, J2. These are the genetic signatures of conquest, and in the aftermath of the Neolithic bloodletting, they were the only ones left standing. What followed the Y-chromosome bottleneck was not a gentle recovery. It was not a slow and steady rebalancing of lost lineages. It was a colonization of the future. From the tangled forest of Y-chromosomal diversity that once spanned continents, a single trunk grew back with just a few branches, and those branches did not merely survive, they dominated. Today, most men from Western Europe carry the Y chromosome variant known as R1b. In Central and South Asia, it is often R1a. In the Eastern Mediterranean, parts of the Levant and Southern Europe, J2 remained strong. These were not the oldest lineages, they were the most victorious, and their spread was not random. Take R1b. It likely originated on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, in the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea, a place now linked archaeologically to the Yamnaya culture. A society of mobile pastoralists who buried their dead in large mounds called kurgans, and may have been among the first to domesticate the horse. As these pastoral warriors expanded westward during the late 4th and early 3rd millennium before the Common Era, they carried with them not only their language, tools, and burial rites, but their genes. Ancient DNA extracted from Bell Beaker grave sites, once thought to represent a purely cultural phenomenon, reveals a sharp replacement of the earlier Neolithic male lineages by R1b males. In region after region, Britain, Iberia, France, the Y DNA of the previous inhabitants nearly vanishes. The mitochondrial data, however, remains mixed. The women were not wiped out, they were absorbed. This is not just migration, it is replacement, a slow-motion erasure, not of populations but of fathers, and it echoes eerily across Eurasia. In Eastern Europe, the steppes expansion also carried R1a, another branch of the same ancestral tree. As the corded ware culture spread through Poland, Germany and the Baltic, we see the same pattern, a dramatic shift in Y chromosomal lineages, with local male lineages vanishing and R1a surging in their place. The pattern is so strong that it cannot be chalked up to chance. This is not the footprint of peaceful trade, it is the residue of dominance. J2 tells a slightly different story, less about steppe conquest, more about early urbanization, irrigation, and elite rule in the Fertile Crescent and Mediterranean. Associated with ancient Mesopotamian societies, the Minoans, and possibly the Phoenicians, J2 is often found in regions where organized agriculture and complex social hierarchies emerged early. But even here, the result is the same, a handful of lineages, outcompeting or outlasting the others. Whether by war, status or structure, these lineages spread like dynasties, filling the vacuum left behind by vanished clans. It's tempting to think of reproduction as something natural, organic, an event that occurs in the privacy of the home or the shelter. But the genetic record tells a more brutal truth. Reproduction at scale can be a function of power, a form of conquest not measured in bodies but in birthdays. Those who won the battles controlled the land. Those who controlled the land controlled the homes. Those who controlled the homes controlled the women, and those who controlled the women controlled the future. Some of these lineages were astonishingly successful. In parts of Central Asia, one Y chromosome lineage thought to descend from Genghis Khan is shared by millions of men. But the Genghis effect is only the latest echo of a much older dynamic. Thousands of years earlier, similar bottlenecks had already paved the way for ancestral male lineages to expand at the expense of others. In genetic terms, this is called a sweep, a rapid rise in the frequency of a particular variant due to selective advantage. In social terms, it is the silencing of rivals. What makes this pattern so chilling is its asymmetry. In every ancient DNA study mapping this phenomenon, the pattern holds. Mitochondrial DNA, which traces maternal ancestry, remains relatively stable. but by DNA the male line is replaced. That means that women survived the wars, or at least they were spared. Perhaps reabsorbed, relocated, rebranded under the banners of their captors. Their lineages continued braided into the emerging powers. The men, however, did not. Their lineages ended. Entire branches of the human family tree were pruned until only a few remained. This was not just the birth of patriarchy, it was the weaponization of paternity. Reproduction became an act of domination, and that domination became hereditary. Fathers begat sons who inherited land, women, and legacy. Clans became corporate bodies, consolidating power, polygamy, and prestige. Status became transmissible not through merit, but through the Y chromosome. One lineage multiplied, 17 others were erased. We see its shadows in the legends too, the warrior king surrounded by concubines, the patriarch blessing his sons with land and livestock. The dynasties that rose not through ideas, but through inheritance. These were not just myths, they were memories compressed into story, encoded in ritual and recited by those who survived. And the echoes remain. Today, global genetic surveys continue to find dominant Y lineages clustered in regions historically associated with elite conquest. It is not merely that certain men had many children, it is that certain structures allowed those men, and only those men, to father generations. Modern surnames too often follow the paternal line. Property laws for centuries favoured sons. And in many societies, even today, the very idea of lineage, of honour, of continuity is still bound to the father's name. That is the legacy of the survivor clans. Not just their genes, but their story, a story they wrote in blood, and which now pulses quietly through millions of veins. It is the story of survival, yes, but also of supremacy, of systems built not to remember everyone, but to remember one. One name, one lineage, one legacy. All the rest, unspoken, lost. The question that lingers is not how they won, but what we lost in their victory. Before the bronze axe gleamed in the sun, before burial mounds bulged against the northern sky, before the cattle were counted and sons were named like property, there were only villages. Clusters of people scratching calendars into bark, sleeping beneath thatched eaves, storing grain in woven baskets, and watching the seasons like sacred clocks. These were not places of war, at least not yet. They were places of rhythm, the drumbeat of harvest, the murmur of ancestors, and in these quiet circles of kin, power had no crown, no badge, no sword, only the authority of memory and the gentle tyranny of age. But something shifted, not all at once, but like frost on the spring fields, spreading slow and irrevocable. The balance bent. Status began to harden like clay around the hands of the few, and in those hands, a new idea was born, the idea that protection could become possession, that strength could seed legacy, that violence, once a reaction, could become a role. And so, across the vast forests and steppe, the figure of the warrior began to take shape. We see the change not in their words, they left none but in their graves. The archaeology of ambition, the politics of burial. In the early Neolithic, the dead were often laid in communal tombs. Men, women, children, side by side. Death was a village too. But by the 4th millennium before the Common Era, that began to fracture. Single burials appeared. Individual tombs. Marked, decorated, prized. A man might be buried with his weapons, his livestock, his symbols of authority, copper axes, archers' braces, drinking horns, amber beads. And that man, more often than not, had been powerful not just in life, but in reproduction. Genetic data shows that the ones who ended up in such elite burials were also the ancestors of many. This was the rise of the warrior elite, and their culture was not local, it was viral. Enter the corded ware horizon. Stretching across Central and Eastern Europe in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, the corded war peoples were not a single tribe, but a cultural phenomenon. Named for the distinctive rope-like patterns pressed into their pottery, they buried their men with battle axes and drinking vessels, facing east as if to greet the sun or honour the direction of conquest. Their graves are not modest, they are announcements. The grave itself a symbol of dominion, the axe a credential, the grave goods a resume. These were mobile pastoralists, horse tamers, cattle breeders, but above all they were kin group warlords. Their society was patrilineal and fiercely hierarchical, and their genetic legacy confirms their reach. In many regions, the spread of corded war culture corresponds with a complete replacement of local male lineages, entire genetic trees overwritten, as if by sword. Parallel to them, farther east and south, emerged the Yamnaya, horse-riding pastoralists of the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Their kurgans and monumental burial mounds rise like earthen punctuation marks across Ukraine, Russia, and Kazakhstan. Their graves, too, are rich with meaning. Wagons, sacrificed animals, weaponry. But more than their burials, it was their movement under that changed the world. Around 35 centuries before the Common Era, the Yamnaya began to expand. With their wagons and horses, they swept across the steppe and into Europe. Genetic studies show that in many parts of the continent, male Yamnaya ancestry surged not gradually, but like a flood. Their Y-chromosome haplogroup, R1b, became dominant in Western Europe. In places like Britain, it replaced over 90% of previous male lineages, not by accident, not by time, but by conquest, by a kind of genetic selection that had nothing to do with fertility and everything to do with control. And then, as if carrying the torch of the New World Order, came the Bell Beaker people. Named for their distinctive bell-shaped pottery, their culture swept across Europe in the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Bell Beaker graves, too, show the same pattern: individualism, male-centred prestige, and a liturgy of warfare. Axes, archery, ornamentation, status displayed in death to mirror domination in life. These were not just cultures, they were ideologies made flesh. Power was no longer something shared, it was something inherited, weaponized, sanctified by burial ritual. The transition is clear in the record. From the communal tombs of the early Neolithic to the patriarchal graves of the Bronze Age, there is a shift not only in how people died, but in how they were remembered. And memory, after all, is the soil in which legacy grows. The warrior chieftain became the reproductive bottleneck. He had many sons, the rest had none. It was a form of sexual selection sharper than nature ever designed. Through force, charisma, or birthright, a few men controlled the future. And those men were not just born, they were built, trained in violence, raised on the rituals of dominance, fed on the myths that made warriors into ancestors. This was not merely a new way to live, it was a new form of humanity, a humanity shaped by warfare, moulded by prestige, and passed down through patriarchal lines like a genetic monarchy. And its fingerprints are still on us. The surnames, the titles, the inheritance laws, the way power still clings to lineage like rust to iron. From villager to warlord, it was not just a transformation of society. It was a mutation in the myth of what it meant to be a man. And from that myth, thousands of years later, we are still trying to wake up. Somewhere between myth and molecule, the truth begins to shimmer, not as a legend, but as a lineage. And that lineage, it seems, was anything but fair. The genetic record is not a mirror. It is a monument. Not to the best ideas or the kindest humans, but to the winners, the violent, the dominant, the reproductively unstoppable. The men who didn't just take the land, but rewrote the bloodlines. We often speak of ancient kings as chosen by the gods, but the gods did not choose. The grave goods did. And buried with those men were not just blades and wagons and sacrificed animals, but the stories of every other man who didn't get to pass his name, his face, or his Y-chromosome into the future. By the time the Neolithic era tipped into the Bronze Age, somewhere between 5,000 and 3,000 years before the Common Era, a new rulebook had been written, not in ink, but in inheritance. Across the vast Eurasian steppe and into the river valleys of Europe and South Asia, elite males began to monopolize not just wealth, but reproduction, and they did it with terrifying efficiency. The genetic bottleneck of Y-chromosome lineages wasn't an accident. It was policy. It was structured. It was intentional. This wasn't evolution by chance. This was artificial selection performed not in laboratories, but on battlefields and in fortified compounds. A prehistoric form of eugenics, waged with copper axes and horse-drawn wagons. In these rising patriarchal societies, the right to mate became entangled with the right to rule. Male reproductive access wasn't about love, compatibility, or even fertility. It was about conquest. And if you didn't conquer, you didn't count. Archaeological patterns show this clearly. While earlier Neolithic burial sites often display egalitarian simplicity, a few tools, maybe a token the burial mounds of the Yamnaya, corded ware, and bell beaker cultures erupt with symbolism. Axes, drinking vessels, imported goods, exotic animals, and even human sacrifices. Each grave was a broadcast. This man mattered. He mattered because he won, and in these societies winning meant siring sons. Sons who would guard the tomb, inherit the power, and do it all over again. The names we do not know, the men whose bones we find in mass graves with no markers, no goods, no lineage, they are not forgotten by accident. They were filtered out, silenced by a system that prized domination and erased its rivals. This wasn't a war of everyone against everyone, it was a war of lineages. Anthropological parallels help us glimpse this dynamic more clearly. Among the Yanomami of South America, as Napoleon Chagnon controversially observed, men who had killed in battle often had more wives and more children. Among the Maasai of East Africa, warrior status correlates with access to mates and livestock. In many Indo-European mythologies, the heroes are not just victorious in war, they are rewarded with women, land, and divine lineage. Think of the Mahabharata, where the Pandava brothers win both the kingdom and the wives of their cousins, or the Iliad, where the war is fought not just over Helen, but over honour, legacy, and the transfer of female bodies as political spoils. This pattern is not coincidental. It is cross-cultural and ancient. Victory, especially male victory, was sexualized. The act of killing and the act of reproducing became bound. Women were not simply victims, they were the currency of lineage transfer. And in these early societies, especially once patrilineality took root, it was crucial that inheritance passed through male lines, which meant that absorbing women from other groups and eliminating their male kin became a reproductive strategy. This was not random, this was structure. What we now see in genetic data as a bottleneck was, in practice, a deeply regulated system of reproductive monopoly. In many regions, a single Y-DNA haplogroup R1b in Western Europe, R1a in Central Asia, J2 in parts of the Near East came to dominate nearly the entire male genetic landscape. Not because these lineages were inherently superior, but because they were shielded by violence, amplified by inheritance, and protected by social design. These survivor lineages were not just lucky, they were ruthless. They built systems that rewarded loyalty to kin, punished outsiders, and preserved power through mating restrictions. The result? A sharp vertical funneling of ancestry. Many men sired none, a few men sired everything. This is not just a theory, it is visible in the Y chromosome charts, where dozens of male lineages simply vanish, and a handful multiply exponentially in a few hundred years. And the pattern wasn't limited to Eurasia. While the Y chromosome bottleneck hit hardest in regions where patrilineal and warrior cultures took hold, similar though less extreme phenomena have been noted in Mesoamerica, Africa, and parts of East Asia. What varied was not the biology, but the social scaffolding. In matrilineal or more fluid societies, male lineage diversity often remained higher, which tells us something very uncomfortable. The collapse of male diversity wasn't inevitable. It was chosen, which means it could have been avoided, and maybe should have, because this form of prehistoric eugenics had long-term effects. It didn't just erase certain Y chromosome lines, it embedded power in a very narrow framework, one where reproduction became proof of dominance, and dominance became justification for control. This is not a quirk of history. This is the foundation of patriarchy, not as a vague cultural attitude, but as a genetic reality, built not on opinion, but on who survived long enough to father sons. And once those systems were in place where a few men controlled wealth, violence, and reproductive access, they self-replicated. You didn't need to keep waging war. You just needed to keep others from accessing women, land, or legacy. Hierarchy was inherited. Inequality became structural, and violence became sacred. Burials became blueprints. Myth became memory, and memory became law. So when we look back at those ancient burial mounds, those kurgans and henges and hill-foot graves, we're not just looking at dead men. We're looking at the survivors of a selective system that reshaped the entire human genome, not through science, not through democracy, but through the blade, through the bride, through the blood. It is tempting to imagine this was all a tragic accident, a phase, a necessary step towards civilization. But the genetics tell another story. It was neither accidental nor necessary. It was enforced, and it was brutal. Which raises the hardest question of all. Not just how did we survive, but what did we become in order to do so? Picture it. A sky split by thunder, not from the clouds, but from hooves. The earth no longer just a field to till, but a road to dominate. Around 5,000 years ago, give or take a century, the winds of Eurasia began to change. The steppe, that vast and often invisible landscape stretching from the Carpathians to the Altai, began to speak, and what it spoke was war. Not the kind fought with bone clubs or by cornering an enemy tribe in a valley, but war waged by mobility, speed, force, and genes. Enter the Yamnaya. Emerging from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, an expanse of grassland wedged between what we now call Ukraine and southern Russia, this pastoralist culture didn't just raise cattle and drink fermented mare's milk, they birthed a storm. They were among the first to master the wagon, the horse, and perhaps most importantly a pattern of migration that looks suspiciously like invasion. What makes them extraordinary isn't just what they brought. Domesticated livestock, bronze tools, and burial mounds called kurgans. It's what they left behind, their DNA, and in the space of just a few centuries the Yamnaya genetic signature spread like wildfire. Their Y chromosomes, particularly the R1b haplogroup, began to overwrite entire male populations from the Danube to the Ganges. To understand the scale of what happened, consider this. In parts of Western Europe, particularly in Britain and Ireland, over 90% of the pre-existing male lineages vanished within a few generations. They didn't just intermarry, they replaced. This wasn't a gentle diffusion of culture, this was demographic conquest. Recent studies, including the landmark 2015 research published in Nature by Hark and colleagues, show that the corded ware culture, which spread through much of Europe during the late Neolithic, contains up to 75% of its ancestry from Yamnaya sources. That is not cultural borrowing, that is a population transplant. What gave the Yamnaya such an advantage? For one, horses. Though not yet fully ridden en masse, their use of horses for transportation, herding and prestige rituals gave them a kind of kinetic warfare unknown to the settled farmers of Neolithic Europe. Combined with the wheeled wagon, an innovation likely spreading alongside or just prior to their rise, the Yamnaya could move not just faster but more efficiently. With their herds, their kin, their weapons, this was not a warband, this was a society in motion. And as they moved, they buried. The Yamnaya were among the first to develop monumental burial mounds, the kurgans, which rose like artificial hills across the plains. These mounds weren't just tombs, they were claims, visible markers of territory, of lineage, of sacred continuity. Inside lay powerful men, or as men often, with weapons, livestock, and grave goods of prestige. The higher the mound, the deeper the hierarchy. These kurgans weren't mere memorials, they were propaganda, proto-statements of legacy. Here lies a man who ruled in life and commands in death. From a genetic perspective, these men weren't just honoured, they were reproductive juggernauts. Their male-line descendants spread at rates that suggest extreme polygeny, where a few men fathered many children, while many men fathered none. This pattern of reproductive skew aligns with archaeological evidence of increasing social stratification. As pastoralism and mobility increased wealth differentials, elite males monopolised not just cattle and land, but women, and the result? A genetic bottleneck that didn't constrict the whole population, but just the paternal line. By the time the Yamnaya influence reaches Central Europe, we no longer speak just of a people, we speak of a phenomenon. Cultures like the corded ware, and later the bell beaker, bear the hallmarks of Yamnaya ancestry, language, and elite burial custom. In the Iberian Peninsula, the Beaker expansion shows an almost total replacement of local male lineages with R1b-derived Yamnaya ancestry. Similar patterns appear in France, Britain, and even parts of Scandinavia. But the storm didn't stop in Europe. Traces of Yamnaya-like ancestry appear as far east as South Asia. The Indo-European languages spoken today by nearly half the world's population likely trace their roots to this mobile, violent crucible of steppe migration. Haplogroup R1a, a sibling of the R1b line, spreads across Eastern Europe, Central Asia and India. Its expansion aligns with archaeological and linguistic models of Indo-Aryan movement, suggesting a common ancestral thread woven through warfare, hierarchy and male lineage dominance. This is not to say the Yamnaya were the first to wage war or the first to migrate, but they may have been the first to do so with such genetic finality. What makes this story remarkable is not simply the spread of a people, but the erasure of others. The genetic record doesn't lie. What once was a tapestry of diverse male lineages across Neolithic Europe became, within centuries, a narrow funnel of ancestry funneled through the bloodlines of mounted warriors and their chieftains. And what about the women? Mitochondrial DNA passed from mother to child tells a different story. Female lineages remained more stable, indicating that while the men were being replaced, the women were being absorbed. This asymmetry is a silent witness to the structure of conquest. Societies were not merely attacked, they were absorbed, restructured and repopulated. Women became the vessels of continuity, men became the casualties of revolution. So here we sit, thousands of years later, with the genetic shadows of the Yamnaya still coursing through our blood. Every surname passed from father to son, every cultural emphasis on inheritance and lineage carries the echo of that prehistoric storm. The map was redrawn, not with ink, but with blood. And from that rewriting emerged the world we now call modern, civilized, Indo-European. But civilization, it turns out, was born in the saddle. Its midwife was the kurgan. Its legacy, the narrowing of the male gene pool, is not just a footnote in human history. It is a monument built not of stone but of silence. A silence where other names might have been, other stories, other songs. They did not survive the storm, but the riders did. But the storm didn't stop in Europe. Traces of Yamnaya-like ancestry appear as far east as South Asia. The Indo-European languages spoken today by nearly half the world's population likely trace their roots to this mobile, violent crucible of steppe migration. Haplogroup R1a, a sibling of the R1b line, spreads across Eastern Europe, Central Asia and India. Its expansion aligns with archaeological and linguistic models of Indo-Aryan movement, suggesting a common ancestral thread woven through warfare, hierarchy and male lineage dominance. This is not to say the Yamnaya were the first to wage war or the first to migrate, but they may have been the first to do so with such genetic finality. What makes this story remarkable is not simply the spread of a people, but the erasure of others. The genetic record doesn't lie. What once was a tapestry of diverse male lineages across Neolithic Europe became, within centuries, a narrow funnel of ancestry funneled through the bloodlines of mounted warriors and their chieftains. And what about the women? Mitochondrial DNA passed from mother to child tells a different story. Female lineages remained more stable, indicating that while the men were being replaced, the women were being absorbed. This asymmetry is a silent witness to the structure of conquest. Societies were not merely attacked, they were absorbed, restructured and repopulated. Women became the vessels of continuity, men became the casualties of revolution. So here we sit, thousands of years later, with the genetic shadows of the Yamnaya still coursing through our blood. Every surname passed from father to son, every cultural emphasis on inheritance and lineage carries the echo of that prehistoric storm. The map was redrawn, not with ink, but with blood. And from that rewriting emerged the world we now call modern, civilized, Indo-European. But civilization, it turns out, was born in the saddle. Its midwife was the kurgan. Its legacy, the narrowing of the male gene pool, is not just a footnote in human history. It is a monument built not of stone but of silence. A silence where other names might have been, other stories, other songs. They did not survive the storm, but the riders did. And just as Indo-European culture reshaped Eurasia through conquest, so too did its gods. The divine became an alibi for the massacre. Indo-European mythos is filled with tales of righteous war, divine vengeance, and holy purification through bloodshed. The Mahabharata, the Iliad, the Eddas, each a different language, a different land, but the same melody. Men chosen by fate to kill and die for honour, inheritance and order. In these stories, chaos is always feminine, a serpent, a witch, a disorderly earth. Order is masculine, a sword, a law, a storm. The gendered cosmology of early Indo-European religion was not accidental, it was structural. It encoded the new social order in metaphor so powerful it still haunts modern religions today. The rise of the father gods was not just spiritual, it was political. And in the genetic record, we see their consequences. The bottleneck that erased up to 90% of male lineages did not occur in a vacuum. It aligned with the expansion of patrilineal, warrior societies that embedded their values in myth. Societies that justified the killing of rival males as divine justice. Societies that absorbed the women and children of the defeated as natural inheritance. These weren't random acts of prehistoric chaos. They were systemic, and they were sanctified. The burial mounds of the Yamnaya are not just graves. They are cathedrals of cosmology. Within them lie men, often young, often elite, often buried with weapons, livestock, wheels, and the tools of both war and rule. Around them are sometimes the remains of those who may have died to serve them even in death. These burials aren't equal. They are stratified, theatrical. They project a theology of dominance. And what is dominance without justification? The gods provided it. In this way, we can see the birth not only of elite male power, but of the ideologies that made that power appear sacred. Even in Homer, centuries later, the echoes remain. Achilles does not merely fight. He is the son of a goddess. His rage is both divine and doomed. The same applies to Arjuna in the Mahabharata, who hesitates on the battlefield until reminded by the god Krishna that killing his kin is his sacred duty. The gods of the steppe did not weep for the vanquished. They cheered. So too did the survivors. Because what these myths encoded wasn't just memory, it was morality. The victors wrote their ethics into the mouths of gods. They turned eugenics into epics. To see this as myth alone is to miss its gravity. This was biology turned to cosmology. The winners not only rewrote the genome, they rewrote the heavens. The divine patriarchs on their thrones mirrored the tribal patriarchs in their kurgans, and between them lay the silence of the erased. To inherit this mythology is to inherit a worldview where violence sanctifies order, where hierarchy is divine, and where the elimination of rivals is not murder, but fate. It is a worldview still encoded in many of our stories, still playing out in our politics, still visible in the inheritance laws and surnames we take for granted. The sons of the sky gods were not just characters in old epics, they were real men, and their real gods helped justify a genetic collapse so total it reshaped the male half of humanity. The storm passed, the stories stayed, and in both, the sky remained the throne of the few. They are not in our books, they are not in our myths. No scroll remembers their laws, no language carries their songs. They are not the ancestors we tell stories about. They are the ones who disappeared. And yet, in the silence between surnames and the long, unbroken chains of inheritance, something whispers. Not all human beings who lived became ancestors, some simply vanished. Entire branches of the human family tree snapped off, burned away, or swallowed whole by the dark centuries of prehistory. Their names were not written. Their bloodlines were not continued. Their languages died in mouths that were never heard again. We remember the winners, the losers became ghosts. It is one thing to say a battle was won. It is another to say that victory erased not only lives, but lineages, that there are entire peoples, entire genetic inheritances, that left no mark beyond the dirt that covers their bones. And it happened not once, but again and again across millennia. From the green valleys of old Europe to the open plains of the steppes, from the river villages of the Danube to the stone-ringed camps of the Caucasus, the same pattern repeated. Bloodshed followed by silence, replacement, absorption, or oblivion. Genetic studies have revealed what the bones could not. An eerie vanishing of diversity. The y-chromosome, passed from father to son, tells a story the myths forgot to mention. At some point between 5,000 and 3,000 years before the Common Era, nearly 90% of male lineages in certain regions disappeared. Not in the sense that men died and were replaced by others, but in the more haunting sense that they lived, and yet left no future behind. Whatever they believed, whatever they built, whatever they thought the world would remember, it ended with them, like flickering torches blown out in a gale. And the question becomes painfully intimate. What if they were your ancestors? What if, through some twist of history, the people whose blood once ran through your veins were cut off, forgotten, unrecorded? There are gaps in every lineage, dead ends in the tree of life, some by accident, others by design. We don't tend to speak of it in these terms, but humanity has always edited its future, not with care, but with cruelty. And this chapter, this prehistoric purge, is one of the most extreme edits our species has ever performed. There are villages that disappeared, not because the land became barren or the climate turned, but because the people who lived there were removed. Excavations at Talheim, Schletz-Aspern and Herxheim tell the tale through fractured skulls and butchered skeletons, but the real evidence lies in what is missing, in the fact that entire paternal lines vanished, in the genetic uniformity that followed, in the uncanny rise of just a few surviving clans whose descendants now populate vast swathes of the earth. This was not the slow drift of populations over time. It was a rapid, brutal rewrite. One lineage written in, 90 erased. And those 90, they left no stories. Think of the languages they spoke. There are over 6,000 human languages today, and even more that have vanished. But what of the tongues spoken before writing, before cities, before conquest? Each lost lineage likely carried its own idioms, metaphors, cosmologies, ways of naming the stars, ways of praying to the soil. We will never know them, because the men who spoke them left no sons and no scribes. Oral traditions died with the throats that knew them, and culture too vanished in the forgetting. Each clan had customs, tools, burial rites, gestures, jokes, lullabies. There may have been entire cosmologies lost in a single massacre, technologies unrecorded, philosophies unspoken, ethics that never took root because the people who held them were absorbed or annihilated. When we study prehistory, we often pretend we are reconstructing a full picture, but we're not. We are looking at the winners, the descendants of the survivors, and mistaking them for the whole. There is no written memorial for these vanished men, no obelisk carved with their names, no songs that remember their gods, but their loss reshaped the human genome. The narrowing of the Y-chromosome bottleneck was not merely a genetic curiosity, it was a deletion of lives that could have been. It was the end of what might have become. Every child that wasn't born because its father was never allowed to live long enough to have children, every idea that wasn't passed on because the voice that carried it was silenced, those absences echo louder than most presence ever could. This too is a kind of genocide, a word we rarely use for prehistory, but perhaps we should, because the scale of erasure is total. It is not that a few tribes lost battles, it is that a significant portion of the male population across vast territories was removed from the future, permanently, selectively, and with enough coordination and repetition that the pattern is unmistakable. This was not a war of nations. There were no flags, no treaties, but it was, in many ways, a war of bloodlines. And here, the story darkens further, because these were not random deaths. Archaeology suggests patterns of targeted male slaughter paired with female absorption. In mass graves, adult males dominate the remains, while women and children often vanish from the burial record, likely integrated into the victors' clans. This was not a natural disaster. It was not famine. It was selection, a brutal form of prehistoric eugenics, where male competition for status and reproduction reached a scale we rarely imagine for such early times. And so the future came to be shaped by a handful of patriarchs, warrior chieftains whose graves are ringed with weapons, sacrificed animals, and the signs of their authority. But the men they defeated, they became nothing, not ancestors, not ghosts, not even names. Their daughters were taken, their sons were killed, their fathers forgotten. The soil remembers more than we do, and under that soil, the bones lie silent. We live today in a world shaped by those absences. Our concepts of masculinity, power, inheritance, they all descend from the systems that survived, and the systems that survived were the ones that erased their rivals. What if other models of living had endured? Matrilineal cultures, more egalitarian clans, systems of balance instead of domination. We do not know what was lost, but we know that what remained was not inevitable. It was chosen by conquest. And that conquest is not ancient history. It is genetic memory. It lives in the disproportionate dominance of a few ychromosome haplogroups, R1b in Western Europe, R1a in Eastern Europe and South Asia, J2 in the Near East. These lineages spread like wildfire after the bottleneck, and with them the cultures that venerated war, patriarchal hierarchy, and ancestral purity. Cultures that buried their dead with bronze and blood. Cultures that still echo in our modern institutions. But no one sings for the forgotten dead. No one lights candles for the erased. We light them now, not with certainty, but with reverence, acknowledging that every silence has a shape, and that somewhere 7,000 years ago, a man looked up at the stars and thought he would be remembered. But we do not remember him. We remember only the hand that struck him down, and that is why this story matters. Not to mourn what we cannot name, but to remember that history is not a neutral record. It is a liturgy of the survivors, a script written in conquest. And between every line, the names of the forgotten still flicker, like embers, like ghosts, like the wind moving through a forest no one planted. And in the spaces where bloodlines used to be, we begin to hear the faintest whisper of what was lost. Not gone, not entirely, just waiting to be remembered. They didn't leave monuments, they didn't carve laws into stone or build thrones from their bones. Their names never reached clay tablets. They didn't gild their weapons or bury themselves with golden bulls. They didn't get remembered because they didn't get the chance. And so, in the long shadow cast by ancient victory, we arrive at a strange balance, the archaeology of absence. The story not told by artifacts, but by what is missing. The archaeological record is a puzzle with most of the pieces gone. We fill in the gaps with bones, tools, ruins, and refuse. But what do we do when there is nothing? When entire populations seem to vanish without a layer, without a ruin, without even a proper grave? That is the riddle left behind by the prehistoric genocide we now call the Neolithic bottleneck, a catastrophic collapse of male genetic diversity between 5,000 and 3,000 years before the Common Era. The ghost of this collapse does not leave fingerprints, it leaves erasures. We can see them not in what we find, but in what we do not. In sites like Talheim, Herxheim, Aspan-Schletz, yes, we find pits and bones and horror, but elsewhere we find quiet, too quiet. Entire landscapes where settlements once thrived yield oddly uniform burial patterns. Where are the older male graves? Where are the rival clans? In some places, we see only the genetic successors, a single dominant Y lineage, spreading like spilled ink across the continent. But in the material record, there's barely a ripple. It is as though the dead were not just killed, they were forgotten on purpose. And so we must learn to read a different kind of evidence. The absence of older cultural markers, the sudden uniformity in grave goods, the erasure of local diversity in tools, pottery styles, housing shapes. The sudden and total silence of once distinct traditions. The languages that never fossilized. The mythologies that never got a pantheon. The songs that no one wrote down because the singers died too early. What do you call a culture that lost its ability to remember itself? One of the most chilling clues comes from gender imbalance in burials. Archaeologists have noted repeated patterns in mass grave sites, adult males disproportionately represented among the dead, while women and children are strangely underrepresented or missing entirely. These are not natural mortality curves. These are signs of capture, absorption, or strategic sparing. The women and children were not left to die, they were taken, folded into the bloodlines of the victors. The men left in the dirt, kneeling, bound, bludgeoned. This pattern is echoed across early Bronze Age Europe and Central Asia. In the ancient settlement layers of now silent fields, researchers often find what they call disarticulated remains, bones scattered, burnt, incomplete, not placed with care, not buried with kin. In some cases, even desecrated smashed skulls, broken jaws, hacked limbs, the kind of destruction that goes beyond death. That says, you don't get a story, you don't get to come back. We also see it in the abrupt appearance of monumental burial sites for a new kind of elite warriors and chieftains buried beneath massive mounds, ringed by offerings, animal sacrifices, prestige weapons. These burials shout, they dominate the landscape, and yet, surrounding them, we often find nothing. No village, no equal graves, No evidence of the people who should have filled out the rest of society, as if the pyramid was built, but the base was made invisible. Consider the eerie metaphor often used in archaeological circles, a cultural palimpsest, a surface scraped clean, overwritten with the next layer. But sometimes that scraping isn't just time and erosion, sometimes it's policy, a kind of prehistoric censorship, entire settlements razed, their graveyards destroyed or dumped, their memory rewritten by those who remained. And the victors were not always careful with the memory of the fallen. Why would they be? The fewer remembered, the less resistance to the new order. This erasure even finds its way into place names, or rather, the lack of them. So many Neolithic settlements lack continuity. They disappear from the map. Unlike later Roman or medieval towns that evolved names over time, these places are cut off. No legends preserved in oral tradition, no gods remembered, just post holes, fire pits, and abandoned layers beneath layers. These are the places where the ancestors were lost so fully that even the stones stopped speaking. Anthropologist Michael Witzel once wrote that all myth begins in trauma. But what about the traumas too complete to inspire myth? The ones that left no bards, no scribes, no oral line to carry the wound forward? That is the archaeology of absence, not science as peace, but signance as obliteration. A quiet so total it echoes. And so we're left with the wind that moves through empty valleys where once 1,000 fathers walked, the wind that passes over fields seeded with unmarked bones, the wind that carries not the names of the dead, but the erasure of their very existence. Whole villages whispered away by wind. Which brings us to a final soft question. How many names never reached the alphabet? How many dreams died before they had a word for dreaming? How many lineages? How many languages? How many lives were snuffed out not in one night, but in 1,000-year silence? We cannot know them, but we can listen. And in the gaps between what we find and what we do not, perhaps we can still hear the shape of their absence, and choose this time not to forget. They tell us the heroic age was golden, that once, long before memory, the world belonged to warriors and gods. They say the past was glorious, that blood was sacred, that battle carved the path to paradise. But what if the golden age was simply soaked in red? What if myth, that most enduring form of memory, was forged in genocide and polished until it gleamed? The further we drift from the blood, the more beautiful the battle becomes. Hesiod, writing in the 8th century before the Common Era, tells us that the third race of men born from Gaia and Uranus were heroes. Not ordinary humans, but demigods. They fought in great wars, died young, and were sent to the Isles of the Blessed. In the myth, their violence becomes virtue, their deaths divine, their glory eternal. But these heroes, these paragons of a warrior past, were not just literary invention. They were echoes of real transformations, cultural scars recast as symbols, massacres turned into songs. Consider the Mahabharata, one of the oldest epics still sung. It tells of a war so vast it obliterated nearly all the warriors of the known world. Between the Pandavas and the Kauravas, nearly an entire generation is wiped out. The violence is divine, the slaughter cosmic. It is a war blessed by Krishna himself, a cleansing of corruption, a resetting of the world. But step back from the poetry, and what remains? A cultural memory of male annihilation of kin groups reduced to ash, of lineages culled, of survivors reassembling a world in ruins. In myth, the war is noble. In biology, it is a bottleneck. Across the mist-shrouded north, the Norse tell of Ragnarok, the end of days. The gods themselves die. The world burns, chaos devours order, only for a new age to rise. This myth too is soaked in a logic of renewal through annihilation. In some versions, only a few humans survive, hidden in the trunk of a sacred tree. They re-emerge to repopulate the world. The scale of this erasure, this chosen reset, mirrors the genetic collapse that defines the late Neolithic. In Irish epics, entire tribes vanish in single battles. The children of Lear are turned into swans. The Firbolg and Tuatha Dé Danann vanish from the surface of the earth. Everywhere the past is remembered as a battlefield, and in the memory it is always someone else's blood that must be spilled. They tell us the heroic age was golden, that once, long before memory, the world belonged to warriors and gods. They say the past was glorious, that blood was sacred, that battle carved the path to paradise. But what if the Golden Age was simply soaked in red? What if myth, that most enduring form of memory, was forged in genocide and polished until it gleamed? The further we drift from the blood, the more beautiful the battle becomes. Hesiod, writing in the 8th century before the Common Era, tells us that the third race of men born from Gaia and Uranus were heroes. Not ordinary humans, but demigods. They fought in great wars, died young, and were sent to the Isles of the Blessed. In the myth, their violence becomes virtue, their deaths divine, their glory eternal. But these heroes, these paragons of a warrior past, were not just literary invention. They were echoes of real transformations, cultural scars recast as symbols, massacres turned into songs. Consider the Mahabharata, one of the oldest epics still sung. It tells of a war so vast it obliterated nearly all the warriors of the known world. Between the Pandavas and the Kauravas, nearly an entire generation is wiped out. The violence is divine, the slaughter cosmic. It is a war blessed by Krishna himself, a cleansing of corruption, a resetting of the world. But step back from the poetry, and what remains? A cultural memory of male annihilation of kin groups reduced to ash, of lineages culled, of survivors reassembling a world in ruins. In myth, the war is noble. In biology, it is a bottleneck. Across the mist-shrouded north, the Norse tell of Ragnarok, the end of days. The gods themselves die. The world burns, chaos devours order, only for a new age to rise. In some versions, only a few humans survive, hidden in the trunk of a sacred tree. They re-emerge to repopulate the world. The scale of this erasure, this chosen reset, mirrors the genetic collapse that defines the late Neolithic. In Irish epics, entire tribes vanish in single battles. The children of Lear are turned into swans. The Firbolg and Tuatha Dé Danann vanish from the surface of the earth. Everywhere the past is remembered as a battlefield. And in the memory, it is always someone else's blood that must be spilled. There is a reason the old gods are almost always warriors. It is no accident that the earliest stories we remember, epics inked in ash and sung through clenched teeth, feature golden-haired men with spears, chariots, and divine right to slaughter. Long before modern wars had manifestos and treaties, conquest was not argued. It was worshipped. Victory was not a consequence of power, it was proof of favour. To kill was to be chosen. To survive was to be sacred. Somewhere in the blurred edges of oral tradition and inherited silence, the story of prehistoric slaughter transfigured into cosmic order. In the hands of mythmakers, genocide became genealogy. Bloodshed became divine lineage. Consider what Walter Burkert called the sacrificial crisis, the moment when violence had to be justified by the heavens or it would consume society from within. Or Bruce Lincoln's grim formulation of myth as ideological narrative myth, he said, is not simply a story, but a story told for someone's sake, told to control, to organise, to legitimise. And if that is true, then we must ask, whose sake did the Indo-European gods serve? In the myths that survive, just like the lineages that did, the winners wrote the endings. Or rather, they sang them across steppes and mountains, from Anatolia to the Alps, until the song was no longer a song, but scripture. We find it in the Rig Veda, where the world is born from the dismembered body of Purusha, a cosmic man offered as sacrifice. We see it in the Irish Laborga Bala Érenn, a mythic invasion cycle in which successive waves of settlers conquer the land until the final group, the Milesians, prevail. And we see it in Hesiod's Works and Days, with its heroic age of demigods and divine warriors, whose glory came not from peace, but from the battles they fought and the bones they left behind. This is not coincidence. This is the architecture of amnesia, the structuring of memory to exclude those who lost. Myth is not neutral. It is a selective lens, a mnemonic device designed to burn certain events into eternity, while allowing others to decay unspoken. Every culture has its silences, but in the wake of the Neolithic bottleneck, the silence is not just cultural, it is chromosomal. When the Yamnaya thundered westward with their wagons and sky gods, they didn't just bring horses and weapons, they brought stories. Stories of divine fathers who legitimized their dominance, of heroic lineages descended from celestial sperm, of tribes chosen by thunder, and in doing so they crafted a cosmology where to lose was to deserve erasure. The conquered were not unfortunate, they were unworthy. This is where Michael Witzel's insights prove haunting. In his comparative studies of early mythologies, Witzel mapped the oldest stories of humanity into two superfamilies, Laurasian and Gondwanan. The Laurasian myth complex, dominant across Eurasia, features a beginning, a middle, and an end, a cosmic struggle, divine warfare, patriarchal ascendancy. It privileges linear time, narrative hierarchy, and most crucially, a logic of succession through conquest. In short, it encodes dominance, and that encoding had consequences. When the myth becomes law, when gods become ancestors and stories become claims to land, then myth is not just culture, it is weaponry. The divine justification of existing power structures, born in battle and calcified in ritual. When you believe your god defeated their god, you no longer see the other tribe as a rival. You see them as illegitimate, expendable, animal. By the time the Bronze Age crystallized, mythology had already become a social technology for organizing memory around the winners. Think of the Mitanni kings invoking Indra and Varuna alongside Mesopotamian deities. Think of the Achaean warlords claiming descent from Zeus. Think of Roman emperors tracing their bloodlines to Venus. None of this was accidental. These were the narratives that sanctified inequality and buried the evidence of mass male death under poetry and paternity. We know from archaeology that women were often spared during prehistoric massacres, but we know from mythology that their stories vanish too. Taken as wives, concubines, or cattle, they disappear into the victor's bloodline. Their gods do not survive, their tongues are not carved into stone, the languages of the dead are unremembered. Even the cadence of their lullabies is gone, and yet we still sing the conqueror's song. So when we look at the myths of divine fathers, Dyaus-Ptah, Zeus, Jupiter, we are not just hearing religious poetry, we are hearing an echo of systemic conquest. We are hearing the war cries of men who not only killed, but rewrote the future to make the killing feel divine. Even now, most of what we think of as ancient myth is the product of long-term selection pressure not just on bodies, but on stories. Survivorship bias, immortalized in verse. The pantheons that seem eternal are, in fact, fragile relics of one evolutionary branch among the Zalms. All the gods we know are the gods of survivors. So we return to the question, whose myth won? The answer is simple. The myth that won is the one that aligned power with divinity, the one that sanctified the bloodlines that remained, the one that made absence seem natural and extermination seem heroic. We still teach it, we still retell it, we still fail to ask what stories might have emerged from the men who didn't live to whisper. And that is perhaps the most chilling thing of all, that we mistake mythology for memory, that we call erasure a golden age, that we sing the songs of victors and call them truth. Because in every age, from Neolithic to now, myth doesn't just remember the past, it decides what kind of future we believe we deserve. It's a curious thing to walk through modern life while unknowingly breathing the ghost air of extinct lineages. Every contract signed with a surname, every land deed, every child given a father's name, it's all a quiet echo of something brutal. For the victors of prehistory did not simply win territory or plunder, they won the right to define the structure of time, inheritance, and even identity. What began in blood ended in bureaucracy, and the system that remains is not merely a legacy, it is the architecture of survival, encoded into law, language, and the very shape of our families. In the ancient world, before the bottlenecked silence descended on the male genome, kinship was often fluid. Early Neolithic societies, particularly those formed before the year 7000 BCE, displayed a remarkable flexibility in how they lived and related to each other. Inheritance was not strictly patriarchal, and archaeological patterns suggest a more egalitarian rhythm in some places with shared tools, communal farming, and burials that lacked strong indicators of dominance or hierarchy. But this balance began to shift with the rise of settled agriculture and surplus wealth. Fields could be counted, grain could be hoarded, and daughters could be traded, guarded, or wed for political gain. What emerged between the years 5000 BCE and 3000 BCE was something harder than survival: strategy. And strategy, when sharpened by violence and secured by victory, tends to fossilize into structure. Patrilineal descent, once a fluid option among many, became the spine of society. You are now your father's son, in a world increasingly ruled by the idea that women married into families while men carried the line forward. This change was neither accidental nor natural. It was engineered often violently by those few clans who had survived the Neolithic bottleneck and were determined to consolidate their reproductive legacy. In Mesopotamia, around the year 2500 BCE, the first formal law codes were chiselled into clay and stone. Among them, rules about property, marriage, and inheritance. Again and again, the logic was clear. Land went from father to son. Wives moved from father's house to husband's house. Children carried the man's name and status. The survivors of the ancient bloodshed had written their victory into law, not just through story, not just through violence, but through the slow machinery of paperwork and priesthood. Even today, the remnants of this architecture remain. Royal lines from the Habsburgs to the Han to the House of Windsor trace themselves through patrilineal descent. Last names in most of the world still follow the father, and although many cultures now recognise a broader diversity of family structures, the bones of the old system still show. In tax law, in passports, in inheritance disputes, in the coded bias of algorithms that ask for your mother's maiden name, but never your father's birth village. Consider the symbolism of surnames. In medieval Europe, as in China, surnames were a way to register one's belonging not just to a family, but to a patriarchal order. They told the state where the power flowed, and often they marked class as much as kin. To have a surname was to have status. In the Roman Empire, freedmen were often required to take the name of their former master's family, a reminder that even freedom was granted from above, not claimed from below. The idea of lineage as authorization to rule, to own, to inherit, took hold across the continents like a new religion, and it spread far beyond biology, because patriarchy is not just about men ruling women, it is about a specific subset of men survivors of an ancient blood lottery ruling everyone. Patrilineality, when tied to wealth, becomes class. When tied to naming, it becomes legacy. And when tied to law, it becomes almost invisible, the water we swim in. The ghost script in every institution that says, without ever saying it outright, you matter more if your father's father mattered too. Even the concept of honour killings, tribal vendettas, and family shame can be traced back to this genetic scaffolding. If you are a man, your daughter's behaviour affects your line. If you are a woman, your body carries someone else's name forward. This is not abstract history. It is the root of how conflict still manifests in domestic and cultural violence around the world. The system didn't just survive, it adapted. It buried itself inside religion, nationalism, caste and capitalism. It did not need to be remembered because it was built into the operating system of civilization. What survived the Neolithic collapse was not just a few lucky chromosomes. It was a worldview one that turned male survival into divine right, inheritance into inevitability, and war into the prelude to governance. We now call it patriarchy, but it began with something older, quieter, and more terrifying. The decision to survive not just through force but through fertility, and to build a world in which those who lost would never even be mentioned. And so we live inside the aftermath, a time machine built of names, property and laws. Every father's house, every surname, every passport. A system that doesn't remember the war because it was the war that wrote the rules. What if the modern boardroom is just a polished cave? What if the corner office, the parliamentary seat, the Ivy League surname etched in glass are merely the latest costumes for a pattern older than language? Tonight, we walk into that question, but not quickly, slowly, as if through layers of dust. Because if you look close enough at the present, you can sometimes see the past looking back, and what it shows us is unnerving. Wealth in today's world is not random, nor is it new. It is, in many cases, inherited not just through money, but through myth. The names that rise to the top in modern oligarchies are not always those who earned the peak, but those who were born into it. Dynasties did not die out with emperors and pharaohs. They metastasized into finance, politics, industry. The ghosts of prehistoric selection pressures now haunt hedge funds and ballot boxes. The violent bottleneck that reduced 90% of male lineages in the late Neolithic did not merely erase men, it refined the formula. Those who survived did so through war, domination, and reproductive monopoly. And what do their descendants do today? They dominate through accumulation, visibility, and the exclusive right to inherit. Elite families, for instance, persist not only through wealth, but through legacy mechanisms so banal we barely question them. Legacy admissions at elite universities are the academic echo of clan loyalty. Inheritance laws, until painfully recently, routinely excluded women or prioritised the eldest male, an unbroken echo from the days when only one son was allowed to remain alive in a neighbouring tribe. Even surnames tell the story. In most cultures, your last name still reflects your father's. Not your mother's, not a shared lineage, just one vertical stripe from the surviving side. And that surviving side is not a metaphor. It is a measurable demographic event. The collapse of Y-chromosomal diversity between 5,000 and 3,000 years before the Common Era has shaped not only the human genome but the rules we built atop it. Patrilineal descent did not end in the Bronze Age. It became law. It became divine. It became the structure through which kings ruled, lands were divided, and daughters were used to bind peace treaties. The ghost in modern power is the same one that killed the village next door and took their women. It is not merely capitalism or monarchy. It is the very idea that some men deserve to rule, that they must pass on their name, their blood, their ownership of the future. Every time a dynasty persists in the modern politics from North Korea to the United States, we are seeing the shadow of a prehistoric bottleneck, where power was secured not by ballots but by the blade. Dynastic politics, too, is a direct echo. The continuation of rule within the same family, even in democratic societies, rests on name recognition and the illusion of legitimacy. But legitimacy is a story, and stories, as we've learned, are almost always written by the few who lived long enough to tell them. We now vote for surnames instead of sword arms, but the principle is similar. Who gets to rule? The one who inherits the throne, whether literal or metaphorical. Even oligarchy today, that strange blend of wealth and state, mimics ancient kin networks, boards of directors filled with cousins, political lobbies shaped by shared schooling, marriages between the children of billionaires. We are not out of the Stone Age. We have simply swapped the village walls for tax havens, the palisade for press releases. But what if we could see this clearly? What if, instead of assuming that inequality is a glitch in the system, we recognised it as the very architecture of the system passed down from the men who survived because they killed or outlasted or outbred the others? What would we do with that awareness? Would we mourn, or would we reimagine? Because the question that now floats in the modern air, soft but inescapable, is this: are we still in the same story? Is the world we live in today, with its wealth concentration, its political dynasties, its reverence for surnames and strongmen, still shaped by the same selective pressure that once reduced our ancestors to blood, fire and silence? Have we truly escaped the bottleneck? Or have we simply disguised it with better architecture and more flattering myths? There is a soft horror in realising that patriarchy is not just a social construct, it is a historical survival, a strategy, once brutally effective, now institutionally embedded. The ghosts are not haunting us. We are living inside them. And as we end this part of the journey, perhaps the most important question is not how the past still haunts the present, but whether we are still, in some dark ancestral corner of the soul, just fighting the same war, only now with suits instead of spears. Sleep well if you can. If you lower the lights just a little and lean in close to the edge of the past, you can still hear it breathing. Beneath the ruins and the redacted lineages and the war memorials disguised as myths, there lies a quieter story, one that does not begin with conquest or kings, but with circles, councils and fires no one claimed to own. Before patriarchy carved its laws into lineage and land, there were other ways to live, and while they left fewer bones, fewer monuments, and no epic poems of genocide, these other ways still whisper from the margins, not as utopias, but as plausible pasts. What was lost was not only people, but options, systems, cultures that offered models of care without hierarchy, leadership without inheritance, gender without erasure. And while they didn't win the war of memory, they might yet win something quieter, a return. To understand what could be reclaimed, we must begin with what was once widespread. Archaeology shows that many early Neolithic societies from Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia to pre-dolmen cultures in Western Europe lacked evidence of centralized authority. No palaces, no grave goods indicating rigid social classes, no consistent markers of male dominance in art or burial. The homes were built equal in size, shranes, if present, were communal. Tools and symbolic items were distributed across genders. There was farming, yes, but not yet kingship. And while it would be naive to imagine these as perfect egalitarian heavens, it is just as naive and historically untrue to insist that hierarchy was inevitable. These people lived for thousands of years without building thrones. They coordinated, they survived, and so they left behind something deeply inconvenient to the myth of human nature: proof that cooperation scaled. James C. Scott, in his rebellious anthropological works like Against the Grain, argues that the earliest states were not organic outcomes of agriculture, but highly coercive exceptions. His portrait of early states is not one of noble progress, but of grain tax regimes and population control. The earliest cities, he argues, were not cradles of civilization, but cages enforced by walls, warfare and elite monopolies. And it is within that shift from mobility to sedimentation, from networks to hierarchy, that the bottleneck of possibility begins. The war that erased 90% of male genetic lineages also helped erase the memory of other options. By the time bronze was currency and gods rode chariots across sky myths, the story was already decided, only it wasn't. Because buried beneath the story of domination is another story entirely, one carried, not in swords, but in the spaces where swords were never needed. From the Hadza in Tanzania to the matrilineal Minangkabau in Indonesia, ethnography still reveals cultural blueprints that don't centralize power in violence. These systems emphasize relationality, care, and resilience over control. And while modern capitalism and globalization continue to erode these societies, they remain living proof that hierarchy is neither natural nor eternal. Yuval Noah Harari's work in Sapiens and Homo Deus reinforces this frame, that what we call civilization is largely the triumph of a particular story, told by those who benefited most from it. But stories can be retold, and unlike genomes, memory doesn't obey biology. It obeys choice. Our species did not choose the bottleneck. We did not vote for patriarchy. We inherited it just as surely as we inherit surnames, laws and national boundaries. But inheritance is not identity, and what was imposed can be unlearned. To say that we can reclaim these lost possibilities is not to imagine a rewind into innocence. The past is not a manual, but it is a mirror, and what it reflects, again and again, is that the present was not inevitable, that the systems which still hold power today, from oligarchic wealth to gendered violence, began in blood, but persist in story, and story can change. What was lost? The ability to imagine something else, what could be reclaimed, the ability to remember that it was once real. This isn't romanticism, it's memory work. And memory work, like archaeology, isn't about nostalgia, it's about options. It's about refusing the lie that we are doomed to keep repeating the same patterns because we were born inside their results. You weren't. You are here now, the lights are low, the story is opening. Let's keep going. We didn't survive because we were the wisest, or kindest, or even the strongest. We survived because we were left, because we were the ones standing when the fire died down, when the blood dried, when the names stopped being whispered. And perhaps it's that very silence that binds us now, not as a badge of triumph, but as a question humming inside the marrow, a silence in the blood. Somewhere far back in the warp of our history, someone made a decision. Or perhaps no one did. Perhaps it was chaos disguised as choice, a war without a commander, a genocide without a name, but it left its mark. In the genome, in the grave soil, in the way we still draw power down a line of fathers, we are, many of us, the descendants of those who erased and those who erased others. And that is not a comfortable thought. It is, however, a true one. You didn't choose the story you were born into. None of us did. We inherited it the way we inherit mitochondrial DNA, unasked for, unedited, humming beneath the skin. We walk through the world with a library of ghosts in our cells, each one silent, most of them unnamed. There were men who never became fathers, whose broad branches snapped before they could even split. Languages that never found a script. Gods who were forgotten before they were ever feared. Not all loss makes a sound. Some vanishes so completely it leaves only patterns, and yet it is from those patterns we've come to understand the unspeakable. The bottleneck was not a myth. It was a filter, a scar in the genetic record so severe that across entire continents, the Y chromosome diversity collapsed by 90%. In the time before metal, before empire, before writing, someone decided, or perhaps learned it, how to end a lineage, how to turn war into inheritance. They did not know they were writing our future. They did it for land, for livestock, for security, for wives, for vengeance. But we are living in their echo, because what followed was not random. What followed was a system, patrilineal kinship, male inheritance, god-kings and named sons. It wrapped its roots around myth and lore and burial and time itself. Power survived by becoming tradition, and tradition survived by forgetting what it buried. But let us not pretend this story is over. It lingers still, in surnames that follow the father, in wealth that compounds across patriarchal bloodlines, in stories that make war glorious and conquest divine, in a world that rewards domination with legacy and silence with invisibility. And yet in the quiet, there is another possibility. Because if all this was invented, it can be remembered differently. It can be told otherwise. This isn't some utopian plea or a historical fantasy. It is a reminder that there were other ways we crushed or forgot, or erased. Non-hierarchical villages, shared inheritance, gods of fertility, not only war.